Good evening, everyone. This is Dan Winter again from fractalu.com. It is Sunday, February 7. Today's course is entitled The Advanced Science of Bliss, Ecstasy, and Peak Perception, the Biology of Bliss, the Biological Imperative of Bliss, and also the related biomechanics of Kundalini in some detail with graphics. And we're going to have a bit of a guest appearance also with Thomas Geckler from Georgia, talking a little bit about bliss and euphoria experiences with regard to the Therify system, and telling a little bit about the plasma stories there. So, welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is intended to be something of a video record of a serious conversation about the electrical, biologic nature of bliss, trance, ecstasy, and peak perception as it relates to defending the idea that it is biologically imperative not just to understand but to pursue literally the following of your bliss, as the great mythologists have spoken for many years about the need to follow your bliss. This is a biologic and electrical engineering defense of the need and requirement for bliss and peak perception. So first, I would like to speak about what it means to make a still point. We're about to describe a phase conjugate or fractal wave mechanical model for the nature of what makes bliss, peak perception, and trance, and the resultant psychokinesis and plasma projection possible, and also the gaining that achieves for your aura and the coherence of what you take with you when you lucid dream and die. You build that aura when you achieve bliss and trance experience, which is sometimes called peak perception, or when we're selling this in the corporate world, and they do write checks to purchase the technology of bliss. We sold the heart coherence system to the advanced management team of ANZ Bank in Melbourne, Australia, to teach their bank managers. Well, in that case, it was to teach the measurement of empathy to achieve embedding with their clients. But it's actually true that the concept of peak perception and peak performance is sellable commercially, not just in the sports world, but in many fields. And it's very important, appropriate, that we learn not just the science, but also the commercial value of these things. And commercial value is not a sinful thing. It helps to generate the economic momentum to make the teaching of bliss popular with young people. I remember one of my perhaps more famous bumper stickers, give me bliss or give me death, was the idea that you do not have a culture unless you're able and have the skill to teach your young people how to have a bliss experience. We say that in most every course, so I've said it too many times, but I think it bears repeating that if we're correct that access to bliss experience is how your aura gains charge, it's how your blood becomes more implosive and steers charge better, you become a better dowser, you feel the magnets with yours. But it's also then how your aura gets coherent enough to project into shamanism, into lucid dreaming, and ultimately to take something like memory through death. And aside from the fact that you could medically rather well prove that the access to bliss experience, which is called harmonic inclusiveness in heart rate variability in medical language, is how you measure the immune system. And this is our subject a week from today when we talk about heart coherence and heart rate variability. So access to bliss is functionally how you get an immune system and how you get immortal. And an electrical engineer and a biologist could make the case with solid science that if this is how you get an immune system and how you get immortal, to at least take something through death, then obviously teaching bliss to young people is a biologic, even a political imperative. And so you could say that Once you have the skill to teach young people how to achieve bliss, then you have culture. Until then, you do not. So all these, centers of culture all over the world, France and Europe and the States, everybody has cultural centers. They're saying, oh, we have culture here because of our wine and our shoe polish and our cheese. And I'm saying, the highest definition of culture. So, culture, the L, the phase shift, to make the phase shift, or L, of the culture, the being of the ancient pure or ancient dragon blood. So literally how ancient dragon blood, which is to say ancestral blood, makes the L, or the phase shift, which is to say translate vorticity from the line to the circle, which is what phase conjugation does, by producing the longitudinal psychokinetic superluminal EMF. So that whole process of making the phase shift is literally the L of an Elohim and the L of pure culture. Thomas Geckler was joking about the shoe polish. No, well, what I'm joking about is, you could be in certain cultures, if the color of your shoe polish isn't right, well, then it's a joke about the fact that you have all these trivial things by which people judge you in culture, when in fact the important things, which is whether you're actually achieving the kind of bliss that gives you access not just to an immune system and to a kind of passageway through death and into shamanism, but it also gives you access to the collective unconscious, the ancestral memory, because that exists also as a conjugate or fractal plasma field, as anyone who has studied Hopi burial grounds can tell you. And as Karatkov measured, we talked many times about measuring where the Kogi went to make phone calls to ancestors, and we now know the electrical quality of the air required. It's fractal, which means simply charge distribution efficient. So access to bliss and trance and peak perception gives you access to collective DNA radio, which is sort of like what comes after the internet, in my humble opinion. Is it every day that somebody tells you what comes after the internet? I think it's true. It's what happens. We're in this part 2 tonight. We're going to be talking about biomechanics of Kundalini, and in one part about that, we're going to talk about how Bentoff measured the ringing in the ears heard by meditators, called sangreal, or song in the blood, or sound current. And he measured the ringing, the high frequency, and I hear it often. And he actually had meditators tune these audio oscillators and measure the frequencies. And then he proved that this was the actual natural resonance frequencies of the liquid ventricle horns in the brain, which is a circulating sound current, phonon geometry, in the head. And then we proved this was in phase locked to the spine liquid pump, sacrocranial. This is part 2 of tonight's conversation. Point being that access to bliss, which is related to Kundalini, switches on this ringing in your ear, this sound current, which is access to ancestral memory, which is literally the collective unconscious, DNA radio. In religious terms, this is the voice of the Holy Spirit, quite literally. And it is also the inner voices of schizophrenia if it's not well understood and not done with discipline. In my own person, and you know that Kundalini is most often diagnosed as schizophrenia, because most doctors, unlike Dr. Lee Sanella, who wrote the book with Bentoff, most doctors don't know what Kundalini is, are clueless. And so most often Kundalini symptoms are diagnosed as schizophrenia. Not to say that schizophrenia is not a serious disease. It is. But there are many who have these kinds of experiences who are on the edge of some form of bliss. And since bliss is not understood medically, nor the biologic necessity to achieve it, our culture perverts all these people whose bodies are simply telling them, get bliss or get dead, as any teenager who could tell you who's seeking sex, drugs, and rock and roll, they're willing to risk their lives in order to get bliss. And our message is simple, that we should respect our teenagers for being willing to risk their lives to get bliss, experience, sex, drugs, rock and roll, because those teenagers are functionally correct. If they do not achieve bliss in a certain biological sense, they are toast. So it is worth risking your life to achieve bliss, and we must respect our teenagers for doing that. And the way we respect our teenagers for doing that is to teach them the hygiene and the discipline, which is a very scientific electrical hygiene to achieve bliss experience. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the science of what the achievement of bliss is biologically. And then in 2 weeks, we have the course, which is the hygiene suggestion, the diet, the yoga, the discipline of thinking shareable thoughts, all the things that attract charge and therefore bliss, which in religious terms is called chi orgon baraka, or the quality of grace, which we now know is the physics of the transfer of biologic plasma, which results from the capacitive coupling, the charge communion of this attractive centripetal conjugate fusion process that can happen in the blood in the presence of bliss. So it is very important that we create a scientific record and a biologic record of what bliss and peak experience is, why it is biologically imperative, so that we can convey this to our medical science, for example, and also to our political institutions. Remember, and this is the review part of tonight. We've said this many times, but the word politics is specifically in the root of body polis, and a body polis it's a cloud of plasma or charge which is generated directly from the result of the biologic climax of bliss. For example, a beehive generates a coherent cloud of charge, plasma, prerequisite before they can swarm. And then in order for them to swarm, there must be royal blood present, the queen, in order for that plasma cloud to be navigable. And what the royal blood is the DNA that is most coherent and therefore able to literally steer the tornado, which is the collective plasma cocoon, which is the only form immortality takes for beehives. Exactly, Robert, a group effect. That's true. They produce more honey. In fact, beehives produce more honey when they're placed on not Hartman Curry, but Peyre line, P-E-Y-R-E, which is the geobiological energy line most deflected by gold, and Stefan Cardinal even worked out the frequencies thereof. And so you find the Peyre lines and their crosses, and you can save the beehives. And that's the golden line, quite literally, in cathedral construction, advanced geobiology. So the reason a body polis defines the very concept of politics is because it is that collective projectable plasma cocoon that results from collective bliss process when it becomes navigable, which is also the only form of immortality for the human condition. Specifically, first individually you learn to lucid dream, then you learn to lucid dream as a group, which requires bliss experience and collective bliss experience, sacred gymnastic and ritual, whatever. And then having learned to lucid dream as a group, if you create that plasma cocoon at the right time and place, hint Dharana or Stargate, the temple, which was Amenti or Amarna, these were charge acquisition implosion fields, bioactive field generator, literally a Shem unto the Lord. And these temples, like Amenti, Amarna, and originally Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem, the place where the Uru, dragon blood, Queen Asa, makes the L, or phase shift translation of vorticity, transverse to longitudinal. And so these stargates were where the wars were fought among the ancients, because they knew appropriately that if they didn't get their show together and get their collective plasma accelerated in these temple arrays, this stargate, this plasma imploder, the real concept of temple, the physics of temple, the real implosive bioactive field generators, that basically you were toast if you didn't make it. In other words, if you don't get to the Stargate in time, you're toast, because And so the wars were fought over the Dirana. And the war over Jerusalem is an example. We've said this many times, and we're always saying it is appropriate now that we cancel that war because the Stargate's broken. Instead, electrical engineers should build another one. And that's what we're here for this evening, among others. So, if, as George Bush may have been unaware, that bliss is the reason politics exists, then you make all decisions, like how are we going to set up the rules for schools? Well, now that we know that children must get the charge coherence in their aura in order to have bliss experience, otherwise they don't get immune systems, they don't get immortal. Now the political leaders, the body politic leaders, know how to make laws about how to build a school. It's simple. Until then, there is no criteria to define politics because because the politicians do not have the answer to Kurt Vonnegut's question. Remember Kurt Vonnegut's question? The hero in the book is sitting down at the bar on Sunday morning ordering the, quote, breakfast of champions, the title of the book, which is whiskey, of course. And he says, what are people for? And if your political leaders do not know what people are for, then obviously they do not know how to build a school or a city or a country. People have a biologic purpose in the universe. It's clear and simple. You make a very coherent aura. That plasma cocoon, the Ka, the Merkaba, that Ka, that coherence of your aura, which is the only definition of Catholic and Cathar, is the coherence of your aura. If you get a coherent aura, then you have the possibility of immune health, shamanic plasma projection, healing, the psychokinesis of bliss we're going to talk about this evening, and the possibility of taking memory through death and taking up collective plasma community. So forging bliss experience is the climactic definer of a successful political party. By definition, I am making a biophysical definition of success for a political party, which is design an environment, a country, in which people can have bliss experience. If you know the biology of bliss, then you can make laws about DNA, about school building, about governments, about prisons, about corrective, about agriculture. For example, family farms should not be functionally illegal. Hint to America. So, et cetera, et cetera. This is again why it is so critical that we have a biophysics definition of what bliss is, because once we know and we make that information shareable, perfectly shareable wave, the only way to immortality, then we have the possibility of forming a government. Now, obviously, if a group of people achieve some form of bliss experience together, immediately they become the enemy of the government if they are not the government. So it's totally clear why in every country on planet Earth it is virtually illegal to launch any form of collective bliss unless you are the government, because biologically, by definition, if a large group of people gets to have bliss together, they become the government. And that's a simple biologic fact of life. The reason is because a collective bliss experience is functionally the way decision making is made biologically, because collective bliss experience is the physics of plasma fusion, which is the physics of biologic agreement. That's why we had all these fun conversations about, the original heart tuner, the original harmonic module, and now what is heartsring.com, our present HRV iPhone software, and newly then in the iThrive software, about the fact that if you get micromotion entrainment between bodies, the real physics of neurolinguistic programming, the real physics behind how Bentoff discovered the physics of Kundalini, which is the second half of tonight's course, that this micromotion entrainment, which is literally just the low frequencies, you know, like in neurolinguistics when their head sort of nods with you, et cetera, et cetera. These are things which indicate when bodies become physically phase-locked, they become capacitively phase-locked until climactically they achieve plasma fusion, the only real definition of Tantra, for example. And my original heart tuner was used in the Tantra school. For example, William Golden in Los Angeles area, the founder of Yoga Journal. They used in their Tantra school the heart tuner because when you teach people to heart phase lock, to heart entrain, the physics of empathy, micromotion entrainment, that's the beginning of the production of biologic agreement. You know, right now, you go to a voting booth and you pull a few levers. Later, when we get our show together, people will vote about once a day on the internet, and 1 billion people vote at the same time and the same stuff. And there's a true instant biofeedback collective agreement called political voting. The real meaning of democracy is the feedback loop becomes shorter the more people that vote more often. And that's now possible electronically. It's stupid that we're not doing it. Because, you see, the rate of feedback between when people vote and when they see the result of the vote, as that feedback loop gets closer, that's called the reflexive universe. That's called the evolution of consciousness. That's called perception coming into the present. So as the feedback loop in the voting process becomes closer and closer, this is the name, the definition of collective agreement-making process. So you could have a collective mind, quite literally, if the feedback loop were well done, if the voting process was instant, you see? And we have that capability. We should do it. So how do you vote when you're sitting in a circle and the military generals are all sitting at one table and they're having a war? What would happen if they gave a war and no one came? Well, if the military generals are sitting at a table and they're having a war, and you hand each one of them an iPhone and show them how to phase lock their EKG, the physics is strong that once their hearts come into phase lock, which is measurable and teachable, this is called consensus process or conflict resolution by definition. And it's the second half of heartsring.com website where you can teach a corporate boardroom how to produce agreement biomechanically. Literally, the physiologic elimination of the possibility of conflict starts with this micromotion entrainment. So how does the voting process happen when you are a military general sitting in a boardroom, and the way you're ending the war is your EKG biofeedback is discovering whose hearts are coming into phase? It's like the grandfather clocks in a room, you know, when the pendulums all phase lock, what happens? So the voting process is physiologically the moment when your heart decides to agree. And then that embedding process produces plasma entrainment, which is the physics of the biological possibility of the collective efficiency. We're going to talk about that in terms of the heart's standing wave down the aorta to embed, and thus the beginning of the physics of Kundalini. It's like a violin string coming into resonance. So when that happens in a group, your vote in that group for the consensus process, the conflict resolution, is literally the moment when your heart agrees. You don't have to say anything, because then your plasma is suddenly embedded, and the short wave is embedded non-destructively in the long wave. And when that little wave embeds in the big wave, it's the mind of man inside the mind of God, which is the collective plasma, then suddenly that becomes collectively centripetal, and now there is a plasma cocoon, a fusion among people, which is the body polis, which is the only possible biologic definition, not just of the purpose of politics, but of what politics only could be, which is when collectively we gather together, carry Mother Nature's silver seed to a new home in the sun. So it's the only way out of here. It's the only way to graduate from kindergarten. So this all starts when we can teach enough about the science of the necessity of bliss peak perception process, the global collective bliss meditations, just like those which 11 different times were measured to cause the solar flares to go, ah, million children sing the same song at the same time. The solar flares 11 times were measured going, ah, they got peaceful. They got centripetal. We made what the sun needed, a centripetal force. We did what the sun made us for, which was to make the centripetal force to hold a star together. And until we do that, it's no way out of kindergarten. It's not escapist. It's not elitist. It's not, it is the only way to graduate from kindergarten. This is why all ancestors that were worth talking to were called sun gods, Atun. And if your ET arrives in a plasma cocoon that came from the heart of the sun, worth having a conversation with that one. But if your ET arrived in a metal device that was not plasma projective, probably from the wrong side of the tracks, Thank you, Kevin. So you're ready to launch the websites. Yes. So what centers this new political science, and I say this is a new polis, political science, is a true scientific, teachable, measurable understanding of what the science of bliss is, because basically it's how to make your aura big. Basically, it's totally in agreement with what Celestine prophecy said. All human interaction is about charge. It's a North Carolina book, by the way, Thomas. And this means not only do you decide who to kiss and what broccoli to eat based on charge, but you decide your politics based on biologic charge. And so once you realize that this means essentially that all decisions on a day-to-day basis are made on the basis of, is this going to make my aura bigger or smaller? Simple question. It's not a subjective question. It's the only real religious question. The reason it's not a subjective question is you go to bio-well.eu and you spend your $500 and you measure your aura. If it got bigger, then that was good for you. If it got smaller, it wasn't. Very simple. And we're teaching the physics of what attracts charge to make your aura bigger. That's your ka. And that ka is what makes you a Catholic or a Cathar. So we always say, now we can measure electrically whether the Pope is a Catholic, because we will find out if his aura is coherent enough to be plasma projectable. And this is the only definition of priesthoods. Priests should be fired unless they're scientists. And the science they need to understand is here tonight. Hello. Yes. We're not humble about this, are we? Okay. So I was wanting to tell a story about a wave. And the story about the wave I wanted to tell was how a still point is made. I mean, what does trance feel like? It feels like you're nailed to a cross. Get up off your cross. Follow me. No, the cross you're nailed to is the cross of the waves of charge, which converged so well that they make a still point. That still point has a centripetal force, the name of which generally is gravity. And you make gravity when you have bliss. It's clear. Was that Philistine prophecy or Celestine prophecy, Susan? That's great. That's what brought you there. I think it was the 10th insight. I think they said was written in Asheville. Cool. Yeah, we're having a little fun here, Thomas. It was a little difficult last night when poor Sarah had an audio problem. Oh, my goodness. But the subject tonight is a subject very dear to my heart, so we can have fun with this one. So, but the lesson, here's the lesson we wanted to teach was, if we understand the wave mechanics by which charge waves produce a still point, then we can understand the physics of BLISS process as phase conjugate or fractal, and therefore centripetal. So this is the point. You know, I'm always teasing the scientists of planet Earth that because they don't know why an object falls to the ground, they don't know what makes any force centripetal, and therefore obviously they can't know what consciousness is, so probably they don't know what people are for. So probably when you meet your scientist to have this conversation, first inquire if they know why an object falls to the ground. If they don't, and it appears that no scientist on planet Earth does yet, until me, perhaps, am I being humble here? Whatever. I say the reason an object falls to the ground is because the radii of hydrogen are golden ratio, and that makes charge implode and accelerate towards center. This was our conjugate cause of gravity course, which is called making a still point. So literally, in the center of hydrogen, the golden ratio ring geometry, and I wrote the new equation that proved that newly for the radii of hydrogen, that the waves converge in golden spirals, and that produces the adding and multiplying of wavelengths and wave velocities, which climaxes in a still point at the center. Oh, I guess we have a picture somewhere in here. Oh, so many pictures, so little time. We just have to play some of these pictures since we're here. So in general, we've looked at this picture many times, but just in general terms, we're talking about this picture here. So the still point was produced when the waves agreed, and the waves could only produce agreement when they converged by golden ratio called phase conjugation, and that is the physics of the only three-dimensional wave pattern, which is fractal. It is the only possible three-dimensional fractal. It's self-similarity optimized, which is conventional mathematics defined as the perfection of compressibility. So when waves converge only in that geometry, they conjugate, they add and multiply recursively, phase conjugate, they can produce a place where an infinite, and here this picture right here, they can produce a place where an infinite number of waves can converge without hurting each other. And so what they do is they produce a compression wave from the vector directions of phase conjugate fractality, dodecaecoconstellation, and they make a place where all the waves agree, and that holds that compression node of plasma or charge in what's called a still point. Literally, the ideal or perfect standing wave. And that starts out in the radii of hydrogen. And then you unpack that further, you get the wave geometry of water, and you unpack that further, and remember the hydrogen bond is the center bond of the ladder rung of the DNA braid. So you unpack that further, the DNA braids recursively, and that still point embedded in very long waves is what happens when the DNA is braided, short wave thread, longer wave string, and braid the braid on the braid, and that becomes a rope, and you braid that braid on a braid, it becomes a fat rope, and you braid that braid on a braid 7 times, and the DNA pilastrates, turns inside out, you have toroidal DNA, implodes, and you have very long wave phase coherence in DNA. It all started with hydrogen, and that is a massive centripetal still point. So the more you embed longer and longer waves on that, eventually Bentov says, oh, when I wiggle, I can move the earth. He had that physical experience, quite literally described it in great detail. goldenmean.info/Kundalini, that's part 2 of tonight's course. So all of this is about massive still point generations, which is then where this phase lock of the charge of the little wave and the bigger wave gets centripetal collectively called phase conjugate or fractal, and that creates a stasis, a still point. For examples of this are when your spine liquid pump makes a still point, literally stops. That's called the healing crisis. often induced by the therapy, measured to have been induced by the therapy by our sacrocranial leader. Or another example of this is when you do the caduceus breathing, and when you reach the still point, we start our courses that way. Long breath, and then 0.618 smaller breath, at 0.618 smaller breath, and you approach the still point in a perfect caduceus called perfect damping in physics. Perfect damping in physics is a caduceus defined by golden ratio, produces the still point at the climax of the caduceus breathing, and out of the still point, whether it's spine liquid or breathing, out of the still point comes increased phase coherence, the healing crisis. Your spine liquid begins pumping again, but more phase coherently. Classic sacrocranial physics, an introduction to Kundalini. So when you make these massive still points, this is called transinduction. This is called bliss. This is called ecstasy. Ek, waves of ek, waves of charge, in stasis, ek in stasis, ecstasy. So making these still points is also the introduction to the possibility of peacemaking. We took this whole conversation about creating stasis, centripetal still points, first in the heart and in the brain waves, and then in a rose pattern of the magnetism on the land, as Phil Callahan taught. And so you make peace on the land. So making peace actually is a scientific curriculum that starts out with the physics of how waves make peace. So if you understood the physics, how a wave makes the peace called a still point, then you can translate that into complete physics of peacemaking, starting with quantum mechanics and then moving to heart waves and brain waves and land waves and planet waves. Callahan proved that war breaks out when village A and village B break the magnetic line between them, because then the emotions of village A don't touch the emotions of village B, and next you have a war. He measured, he proved it, Ireland, Yugoslavia, Israel, it went there, measured, when the magnetic lines in the land break down. So this became the curriculum for our University of Peacemaking, goldenmean.info/peace university. And we have the complete curriculum for heart, peace in the heart, peace in the brain, peace on the land. Basically, Callahan knew the next tribe down the Amazon River is going to be headhunters if the magnetic lines cannot go through their land, called magnetic flux permittivity. So if the magnetism connects, that's called permission to touch. That's the opposite of war, and you can prove it, which is to say, make peace among waves. So you can see now that if you were teaching a science of trans-induction, bliss process, probably you would not want to do that in a steel and aluminum building with dead air-conditioned air and lots of electrosmog. Because, by the way, you cannot implode charge in that environment. Life cannot propagate. Auras cannot breathe. Seeds cannot grow. So dead architecture is a bad place to do bliss. In other words, another way of saying that is that do not attempt bliss, which is to say, do not attempt implosion in an electrical environment where you do not want to suck that environment into your body. If you have this wonderful stone circle in the middle of a wonderful forest, in the middle of a wonderful mountain range, whatever, good place to try your bliss practice. Cool. But if you have a metal-lined room full of wires and electrosmog and steel and aluminum and dead air, bad idea to try your bliss process, because you can't implode that environment. Because having bliss is what Adam Trombley and Jesus called, this is my body. Well, what they meant was, you can see two webcams of me. I've split my, well, I don't know how that happens. But what we meant by this is my body was that the bigger your plasma field embeds, your body becomes Holy Communion. Your body becomes the earth. You know, our word for Ea, Enki, which is our last class on the ET origins. The word Ea, Enki, Osiris became Earth, Ea's Earth. And that word Ea, D apostrophe EA, became God. Well, he was just someone who was hanging about saying, if you don't get a big aura, you ain't going to get very far. And if you want to call that God, it's fine, but it really amounts to coherent plasma. So study plasma science if you want to be the Pope, because that's what it is. Now, before we have our little conversation with Thomas here, I was supposed to complete part 1 of this evening's course. And part 1 was a review of the basic science of a phase conjugate model of perception. Again, just to be clear, that complete science is outlined at fractalfield.com/conjugate perception. That is the background science for part 1 of tonight's course. Basically, that phase conjugation creates these still points, this implosion, and that is the physics of the cause and origin of perception and peak perception and gravity. And you make gravity when you create intense bliss. In fact, you float when you pay your debt to gravity because you get more fractal than the Earth underneath you. This sounds like esoteric stuff, but my friend saw, it's a long story, saw her mother float here. We actually know, we've seen it happen. We've seen the saints float. This is not just a myth. This is real physics, and plasma can do that. Walk on water, see God. The sign at Woodstock had some physical meaning. Okay, so the slides we were supposed to use, yeah, is there really 2 pictures of me in your camera there? I'm not bilocating, it must be a glitch. Yeah, well, actually, it was our friend from Paris whose mother was quite literally a saint. She was a kid and she walked in and saw her mother floating. And actually, Valerie still communicates with that saint. It's quite a story. You haven't floated yet, but you did, however, have 2 Therapy sessions, so that's good. That's good. Okay, so the core part, and this is review now, but you did bilocate. You had multiple presences. This was very interesting. Very cool. I mean, basically, when your aura becomes very coherent, you can phase couple at a distance. It starts out with this idea that, supposing you had 2 Therapies and they were perfectly phase locked, this would literally be a stargate. It would be a wormhole. You could bilocate. You could move substances from one to the other. So bilocation is the result of massive phase coherence. And remember that massive phase coherence is identical with fractal phase conjugation. What we're saying is the wave coherence you call a hologram, the climax form of coherence is fractal or phase conjugate, quite literally Golden ratio based. And this is intuitively obvious if you just think about it. Every wave node in a hologram contains information about the whole hologram. This is old news to physics. What that means is that every wave node potentially has compressed, and that's the key word, into it information about the whole. Well, the climax form of compression is proven, it's the mathematics of fractality, but in wave mechanics, the climax form of compression, called fractality, is phase conjugation. Phase conjugation is fractality for waves. Therefore, phase conjugate fractality, perfected compression, defines the climax form of phase coherence. So if you built a hologram that looked like this, also called hydrogen, DNA, Earth grid, and zodiac, which are all dodecahedral, you create that transmission of efficient information, which results from phase conjugation, which is producing the longitudinal compressional waves, which are superluminal and faster than light, and phone calls to God, phone calls to ancestors, the physics of spiritual communication, the absolute proven physics of telepathy, cozy rev mirrors. So this is basically installing the internet between stars. That's what it is. Dharana, Stargate, lots of words for this. So bilocation starts with understanding that kind of stuff. Quantum archaeology, pretty cool. Yes, yes. So that's why, Pretty soon we're going to be placing the therapy at the magnetic line crosses and measuring them in nanoteslas exactly the way they installed the Kozyrev mirrors just before Korotkov proved this was the physics of telepathy. He proved it 3,000 miles apart every time. Very consistent, replicable, dependable, solid, clear telepathy. This was not subjective. This was not woo-woo. This was physics. And how did they do it? These are the phase conjugate nodes. And the diameter of the metal tubes, the Kozyrev, are phase conjugate to ATP, ADP, biologic microwave, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So this is mitogenic radiation, DNA radio optimized when the plasma tubes, the therapy, are placed at the proper ley line crosses. And this is done when the right astrology is present. I mean the physics of planetary alignments. Remember the physics of gravity radio? Or as the Sufis say, planets and stars experience gravity relations erotically because when Jodie Foster traveled in the movie Contact, she took a dodecahedron. This is a clue. The wormholes between planets and stars are these gravity winds that travel through these phase conjugate tubes, the real wormhole physics. Because the superluminal component of the longitudinal EMF requires the conductivity array, which is a phase conjugate array, which is the gravity tubes between stars. That's why when the Earth comes between them, when the moon comes between the Earth and the sun, it cuts off the DNA radio, and all the magnetic lines collapse because the moon is opposite to phase conjugate dielectrically, and therefore it's poison to biologic plasma. Ingo Swann found that out when he did the remote viewing to the backside of the moon for the military. Ooh, it's not just that the bad guys live there, it's just that parasitic plasma, quote unquote, the bad guys, cannot withstand the presence of implosion. So, of course, the bad guys live on structures that don't phase conjugate the hollow metal moon, the Death Star. I'm not saying we don't need it. I'm quoting Gurdjieff. Coherent emotion feeds the sun. Incoherent emotion feeds the moon. There's got to be a way in and a way out. The incoherent emotion, the hollow metal moon, you get the. So this is intro to the physics of astrology is actually capacitive coupling. Weber didn't need $1 million to measure a gravity wave. Hoda, Wanig, and Ramsey, they had used 25-cent capacitors. This is all that again, this is review goldenmean.info/gravitypolitics. How Hoda, Wanig, and Ramsey measured these gravity waves. So we want to return to our focus here, which is the physics of bliss. And in this part of tonight's course, we were supposed to review and get clear about how phase conjugation is the physics of perception, and therefore the physics of peak perception of bliss. So this, and again, this is just the review section from the article Conjugate Perception. So here is the frequency signature predicted by the equation on the cover of my book entitled The Origin of All Biologic Negentropy. And here's my equation: Planck length and time times exact exponents, integer exponents of golden mean ratio. And it produces, that equation produces these frequencies: 2.78 hertz, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, and 19 hertz. Those frequencies are, here in green, the Schumann resonance harmonics, called phase conjugate negentropic pump wave. Why Gaia is self-organizing. Those frequencies are the Priori device, and therefore the therapy device. Those frequencies are, right here, the frequencies of the brain waves which define bliss process. This is the old bliss tuner, which soon will be replaced in an iOS environment. We've already have the hardware, we have the team, we have the support, the programmer. It's happening. The new brainwave environment will be a sequel to iThrive.com, hrv-app.com, because we have new partners, and part of it will probably be the Monroe Institute themselves, which is wonderful. So we're going to have a new EEG device. It's going to be wonderful, very sexy little headset, Bluetooth to your iPhone, and you're going to see all this cool stuff and develop. Because not only are we going to measure when the brain waves get to golden mean ratio, just like this lady in Australia having this bliss experience, her head's back. She's having this euphoria, this bliss moment. And we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 harmonics in her EEG in golden ratio. Perfect right-left phase lock. And we know several things now that we did not know then, which will be wonderfully in the newest brainwave physics of psychokinesis, the real solution to the Monroe Institute quest. How do you project your plasma? You know, remote view, lucid dream, travel to stars, send your plasma. The definition of shamanism. Plasma projection results when charge implosion happens. So the right brainwave biofeedback system, which will now be in the sexy headset right to your iPhone right here. By the way, there's even a new website for that. This is the first time I'm announcing it, but the website for that is going to be flameinmind.com. It's already registered. It's happening. It's wonderful. We're going to teach how to make the flame in the mind. It's real. And this is, so what we're adding to this physics here is we now know that the right and left hemisphere, it's going to be probably about a year, Robert, till we get this. But, well, the pieces are all in place. The programmers have already figured out the Bluetooth interface. It's going into the present system. I mean, we picked out the hardware. We've got the programmers developers kit. It's happening. And so, in addition to teaching you how to make coherent alpha, step 1, 2, get your alpha to beta here. This is the alpha right here. In this case, the alpha is at about 8 hertz, about 8.2 hertz here. But so first step, coherent alpha. Second step, alpha phase lock, right, left hemisphere. Third step, phase lock the alpha to the beta. Fourth step, make that ratio golden mean ratio, which right here in this case it is, which is what these computer lines right here, the green and the purple mean. The alpha to beta becomes golden mean ratio. And then fourth step, get alpha to beta to delta, and ultimately gamma. The Tibetan gamma. So the cascade is golden ratio. But what we newly learned, 2 more things, is that when this cascade is tuned more accurately right here, the best alpha will be at 7.29 hertz. Not just because that's the main Schumann, but that's phase conjugate to Planck, which is what gives you access to the 0 point, literally the mind of God. So we even know what frequency the best alpha will be. And finally, we know something more, which has never been known before. And we would like to thank Bill, Elizabeth, Donovan, in some sense, for this idea, which was that the right and left hemisphere must be 180 degrees out of phase, because when the pine cones kiss noses, they must be mirror images. That's called phase conjugation optimized. And that's how you make the longitudinal wave, defining the compressional psychokinetic flame in the mind. So now we can incorporate all of that into this brand new, super powerful biofeedback system for plasma projection, which is, we have new partners. We want to thank Chris in Belgium, Professor of Electrical Engineering, that whole team bringing this together, programmer Patrick, and this is going to be, we're offering to partner with the Monroe Institute. We're grateful that Chris is on the board of directors, and whose need to teach people how to plasma project, how to remote view, how to project out of their body. I mean, there is a beautiful history to this story. This is a little Monroe Institute side trip here, a little history. Ed Wilson was in those early days, yeah, maybe he is. Ed Wilson in those early days was the research director of Monroe Institute and a friend of mine. And Ed had discovered that if you do the binaural beat of the brain wave of the sounds, heterodynes, based on golden mean ratio, he produced a psychokinesis. What actually he produced was a way to send people out the top of their head. So Ed Wilson discovered this golden ratio based binaural beat, which is later this became the perfect, the most psychokinetic possible binaural beat of implosion sound, which is the software app now we invented and put together with Mark Crook's help. Thank you, Mark, in Germany and Netherlands. At fractalfield.com/implosion sound, you today can download what I firmly believe is the most psychokinetic possible and probably somewhat dangerous, and there are warnings, binaural beat audio. Put it in your headphones, software called Secret Sound, downloadable there at that link, fractalfield.com/implosion sound. And that became the software that feeds and drives the low frequencies to Therify. And now we know what the perfect cross-hemispheric binaural sound would be. It's happens to be the picture on your screen right here. That's the picture. That's the frequencies we feed. But we now know how to direct that 180 degrees out of phase to the audio hemispheres. So Ed Wilson says, oh, super powerful psychokinetic, drives you out the top of your head. And Bob Monroe said, danger, danger, Will Robinson. I mean, he said, this is dangerous. And he's right. It is dangerous. It's powerful and it's dangerous. Anything that's powerful that's the way it is. So Ed Wilson gave up. Well, I won't say he gave up on Bob Monroe, but Ed Wilson got in his car, and he's old and he's dying, and chose to drive 12 hours to my farm to make a film about this with me, because I had just spent half a lifetime discovering about golden ratio in the heart and golden ratio and wave mechanics and golden ratio and golden ratio. This was me. And I was like the whiz kid nerd of the woo generation. I was like the Forrest Gump of the spiritual scientists. That's who I was in those days. And so Ed Wilson drives to my farm. We make a film about this deal. So here I am, like at the beginning, with the Monroe Institute, and Laurie Monroe was friends after that. It was nice. They were friends. But, and Ed Wilson and Bob Monroe was probably right to say it was dangerous. But this is the history of the background, which then later became the Therify and plasma projection. So today, and well, first of all, I have to say that my friend Russell Wright, and hi to you, Russell, in Hawaii, wherever you are, a wonderful guy, Theme Zoom. Russell Wright tried this psychokinetic binaural golden ratio recordings in the headphones from Ed Wilson. Yeah, you're right. It's a form of Ong's hat. It's related to time travel. Time travel is the propagation of the loop of the superluminal component of the longitudinal EMF. That's what it is. We know that the longitudinal component of the generated electromagnetic frequencies caused by phase conjugation in biology, not only is it by definition and well measured to be faster than light, like Professor Raymond Chow's work, 4.23 times c, the speed of light, measured, Professor Raymond Chow, which is exactly golden mean ratio cubed times the speed of light, which is proof of my prediction of the nature of gravity caused by golden ratio phase conjugation. So not only is the superluminal component faster than light, that is the definition of time travel, which actually means, time is only rotation of charge. So when the rotation of charge can produce superluminal coupling, time travel is defined as phase conjugate or fractal. In other words, the definition of coincidence is the possibility of coupling charge rotation at different phase velocities. The optimum form of that charge coupling, called faster than light charge coupling, called coincidence, then becomes fractal or phase conjugate. And we proved that and had the whole conversation about fractality and time. The definition of the possibility of coincidence at the original article, goldenmean.info/coincidence. So today, when we get, now that Chris, wonderful, Chris Van in Belgium, Jane's partner, we're grateful to Chris, electrical engineering experience, runs a healing center in Antwerp, that Chris has become central to our implosionamp.com 0 point energy project. And Chris is deeply involved in the iThrive Heart Biofeedback Project. And Chris now, because he's on the board of directors at Monroe Institute, and we're inviting and offering and sending this film to the Monroe Institute along with Chris to say that what a beautiful opportunity to bring to completion what Ed Wilson and Bob Monroe started so many years, it's got to be about 20 years, I don't remember exactly, so many years ago. Now that we know the phase conjugate definition of trance, peak perception, and plasma projection, literally the physics of psychokinesis, the physics of flame in the mind, is the plasma containment, which is called making a still point, exactly what this film is about. That's why we're so passionate and enthused and excited to offer to develop this new ultimate biofeedback system for brainwaves in partnership with the Monroe Institute, because we so passionately believe this will be the climax form of the physics of psychokinesis. Yes, it's dangerous, and yes, it's political, but oh, by the way, if we don't know how to make a flame in the mind, we are toast. So we have to accept that risk and make this information shareable and say, hey, let's build this together. Let's teach people how to do plasma projection using physics. And it starts with brainwave biofeedback, and we are going to have the ultimate tool. It's very cool. Next time, we're going to show you the very sexy new headset that's going to be used to do this. It's emotive. Is the emotive.com, and the headset is you will see it's called the Insight. You can actually go look at the new sexy headset that we're going to be broadcasting Bluetooth brainwaves to your iPhone. We have the interface, we have the hardware, we're having the fun. It's going to be so sexy and so cool. And we can actually link that whole software environment to the heart rate variability, the iThrive, because it uses the same interface. It's so cool. So you can get the phase coherent implosion in your heart rate variability, breathe the caduceus, and then you can, same environment, watch this happen in your brain waves. And when you do it, you get the phase conjugate implosive model of perception, and your plasma is implosive and projectable and phase coherent. And this is remote viewing 101 optimized. This is plasma projection optimized. This is the definition of shaman. This is astral projection, remote viewing, etc. Okay. So we're excited that we're developing this together, and we're inviting the friends of Monroe Institute to play with us with these concepts right here tonight. And we're happy to make this video as a present to you, saying, let's play together because it's fun. And oh, by the way, we might save the earth. Now, this next slide here, we're going to do in more detail in the Kundalini section. This was the slide I wanted to do here as we introduce Thomas here. Wayne Leonardi is saying, in my death experience, it was difficult to break out of the still point. Yes, that's right. Wayne, you're very right to bring up the concepts of death experience. We know that the sequence of visions seen by near-death experiencers, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, the sequence of symmetries which define the map to how to die successfully, called the Heinrich-Kluwe form constants. We have them here at goldenmean.info/immortality. So we know why your whole life flashes before your eyes at the moment of death. It's called the physics of non-destructive compression. And those Kluwe form constants are quite literally lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, the sequence of the braid operations of DNA doing plasma implosion to get you ready for implosive charge compression through the phase conjugate fractal still point, enabling you to embed in the high velocity superluminal longitudinal fractal field called the collective unconscious and the communion of saints, quite literally the fractal field. And if you can't get up to speed and embed in that, then your aura dissipates at death. So your DNA is saying, get fractal or get dead. And there is a still point, and that is the temptation of death. Death is a beautiful, easy entry, because entering the still point is very tempting. And coming out of that, coming back from the near-death experience, and near-death experience, the NDE experiencers tell these stories in great detail. And it worked pretty well for Dannion Brinkley when the lightning brought him to the still point. The movie Powder. It is critter clear. Yes, it's crystal clear. Exactly. Okay, so that's another whole aspect of this, that the bliss prepares you for death, because functionally, electrically, entering bliss is the same physics as entering death successfully. Same thing. This is why the Sufi master says, come to bliss as you would to a lover. So whether it's orgasm, tantra, birth, or death experience, the plasma physics is all the same. It is prepare for implosive, non-destructive charge compression, quite literally the fractal field. That's why we know the environment, we know the dance, the breath, we know the dance, we know the heart harmonics, we know the brainwave harmonics to make successful birth, successful death, successful bliss, successful tantra, successful orgasm possible. It's literally the physics of bliss. And Wayne is saying, do not verify alone. It's true that, the group process here has more potential. And in fact, people who learn advanced Buddhist meditation, for example, we find the ones who are likely to emerge still sane were like, for example, women who had experienced childbirth. Excellent. So I just wanted to do this one last slide here, and then I wanted to ask Thomas if he's still willing to tell a few stories here. But this was the slide we used to introduce Therify. And this is a slide here. Let's see if I zoom in a little bit more about the biophysics of cell metabolism. Basically, what we're saying is that this is a way of understanding, for example, cancer and how systems like the Therify could relate to a solution to cancer, a solution to charge compression. Obviously, cancer and pain are compression that's not working. We say you restore compression, you eliminate pain. We know that most people who have pain, localized pain, for example, get significant help. Almost everyone who has localized pain gets significant help from the Therify. This is documented already by the French group, among others. And the reason is that pain is basically charge compression that's bleeding because fractality is broken. So you restore compression, you eliminate pain. And it's obvious, anybody's looked at wound healing, the first thing you do is compress. Well, electrically restoring compression is to restore phase conjugate fractality. How does that work? That's what this slide is about. That originally I learned this from Professor Earl Etienne, University of Massachusetts at Worcester biophysics medical doctor. And he taught me that cell metabolism is basically a distribution of charge inertia in what he calls enzyme pools. So basically, the charge that comes into the cell arrives at relatively longer wavelengths. Think of it as food. And then the cell massages that incoming charge into enzymatic pools, different areas of metabolism. If you look inside the cell and see where the energy is stored, energy in the long wave has less order as it comes into the cell. The cell takes the long wave, think of it as a food, and massages the envelope and braids it recursively. Look at this caduceus here. And the other enzyme pools, one of them could be called DNA precursors, which is shorter wavelengths. And then climactically, the cell massages that charge energy into wavelengths which are much shorter and much higher information density, which is the raw material of DNA itself, and part of that is very high quality ultraviolet light. And Professor Etienne insisted to me that that energy metabolism in the living cell was largely about the fabrication of very high quality ultraviolet light, UV. He called that the blue fire or the sex juice of the cell. So when the cell finally gets done with its food and massages the long waves down to this short wave, high quality UV, then this blue fire is like the sex juice of the cell, the creative juice. And when that blue fire, the plasma cocoon, builds up at the center of the cell, that's the moment, just like the beehive ready to swarm, at which the cell has to do something with the high quality ultraviolet light. It's like the reservoir for high quality UV has built up, and now the cell has to take action. It must do something with the high quality UV light sex juice. And the cell then makes a choice. That high quality UV light, which is literally the creative juice of the cell, either has to be distributed, which is to say go into collective cellular activity, which is to say it has to be propagated across the membrane and shared, which is called touch for cells. And cancer is defined as when the cell does not respond to touch and thus inhibit replication. It's the only real definition of cancer. It's called contact inhibition. It means, does contact with other cells inhibit replication? If it does, by definition, it's not cancer. When contact with other cells does not inhibit replication, that is the definition of cancer for biophysics. So, if this high-quality ultraviolet light can be distributed, then cancer is avoided. The reason is because if the high-quality ultraviolet light builds up at the cell center and does not get distributed, the only path possible in the center, in the cell nucleus, for the high-quality ultraviolet light is replication. Meiosis and mitosis is a dance. It's literally a Sufi dance. If you ever watched meiosis and mitosis under a microscope, you could not avoid envisioning a Sufi dance. That's what it is. The function of ritual is to embed yourself in a long wave. Meiosis and mitosis is a ritual dance to embed the short wave, which in this case is the ultraviolet, into the long wave, which is the DNA dancing into this long column. It's a beautiful dance called meiosis and mitosis. We should play the video here. I should have lined that up. It's a lineup. So, when kids have creative juices as teenagers, if you teach them a way to distribute the sex juice, you teach teenage kids dance and yoga and art and theater, creative outlets, then they don't have babies too soon. But if you have a bunch of teenagers and you haven't given them any creative outlets, you're going to have premature babies. It's the same physics for cell metabolism. So, for example, if you use lecithin on the surface of a cell, which permits better distribution, touch, wetness, softness, it permits the ultraviolet to have a way out of the cell, then you reduce cancer with lecithin, a surfactant, literally detergent, because it permits the cells to touch and distribute the ultraviolet. So the trigger for premature cell division, called cancer, is the buildup of the high-quality ultraviolet light at the cell center. Wonderful. This is what this slide is about right here. Now, what does that have to do with the therapy? Well, the therapy, which is called phase conjugate plasma, creates an implosive place for charge communion at the center to achieve improved charge distribution. Because a phase conjugate or fractal field, which is exactly what's happening between the plasma tubes, again, visualize pine cones kissing noses of the therapy. And that plasma communion at the center point of the two pine cones kissing noses is the charge distribution which optimizes in what the therapy is, phase conjugate fractal plasma. That's why the therapy helps people restore feeling where blood isn't circulating. It's very good for people who have lost feeling in a hand or a finger or a toe. Very good for that because it restores charge circulation, therefore blood circulation. And recursive implosive charge circulation is called feeling. That's what it is. It's implosive plasma. It's this embedding process. Feeling is when the field effect can propagate well from a center point. That's what feeling is. So that's how therapy restores feeling by restoring flow. So restoring charge circulation is exactly how UV distribution is accomplished. Restored compression, restored fractal distribution. And so electrically perfected circulation is the opposite of cancer. In fact, cancer is defined as ultraviolet that forgot how to circulate. So this is a little background on why restored fractality, restored compression, not just reduces pain, but eliminates things like cysts and tumors, because once the tumor learns a way to distribute all that creative juice, suddenly the cells stop being antisocial. Look, cancer cell is the definition of cells becoming antisocial. And sociability among cells, which is the opposite of cancer, is defined electrically as perfect charge distribution, which is fractal or phase conjugate, which is what tonight's whole conversation is about. Now, the point here is that we are going to take this graph right here and the ultraviolet created in that graph right there and start our conversation about the physics of Kundalini in a few minutes. There was one more slide we were supposed to do here. Slide number 9. 1 second. Oh, yes. So a review of what we covered so far in terms of a phase conjugate model of perception and therefore peak perception and therefore bliss. This is the review. This is a graph from the book. So my new equation, exact integer exponents of golden ratio times Planck length and time, called a phase conjugate model, cause of biologic negentropy and cause of gravity and cause of perception and cause of bliss and peak perception. So that equation, Planck length and time, predicts right here in this chart exact radii of hydrogen, exact Schumann planet harmonics, the brainwave harmonics of bliss. It predicts virtually the exact duration of the Earth year and Venus year. It predicts the frequencies Priori and Elizabeth Rauscher used to heal and for pain reduction. And here we see that equation predicting almost exactly. This is the center point of heart rate variability LF, low frequency, and the center point of heart rate variability HF, the nominal perfected heart, fractal heart. And the center point frequencies of HF and LF are 0.0959 hertz and 0.251 hertz, which happen to be nailed bang on by my equation, Planck time times golden ratio exponents. And this LF frequency, which is almost exactly 0.1 hertz, is exactly the Meyer wave 0.1 hertz, which is the blood pressure natural resonant frequencies of the whole body, the whole classic defined perfect Meyer wave. And that's where we're going to start our conversation next week on heart rate variability. So negentropic perfected phase conjugate phase collapse, charge collapse, is the definition of all these measured and documented forms of biologic negentropy, hence peak perception. So phase conjugate cause of perception and cause of gravity was the review of part 1 of tonight's conversation. Part 1 took a little longer than I had visualized because we just had too much fun. But before we go on here, first the question, is that charge distribution stored in the cell memory, or does it have to be constantly repeated? Well, no, that's the whole idea, is that we know that golden ratio is totally the geometry of the DNA and DNA braiding, goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. All the pictures, beautiful pictures there. So this creates a fractal field within which the cell can compress charge memory. So when you say is a charge distribution stored in the cell memory, the DNA radio is the charge distribution efficiency. And that is a charge or plasma longitudinal field effect component constantly radioing between all DNA in the galaxy. DNA radio is a collectivizing device because of the conjugate charge fusion at its center. That's what the shaman Sarah meant last night when she said, visualize the 7 spins taking you back to the center point, because at the center point you're communing with the divine. That divine exists specifically in the Planck phase conjugate DNA radio, hydrogen, DNA braid, etc. And that is the charge storage of cellular memory, for sure. And when you do the long wave, graceful dances, Tai Chi and yoga, you embed in those longer waves. When you have bliss, you get phase coherence in a long wave, etc. etc. So if you're relaxed and graceful, you don't have to constantly repeat that. It's embedded in your DNA. Okay, we had some fun. I carried on. Before we do part two here, and since my voice is another sip of tea, I thought we would ask Thomas Geckler, if you're still there and still willing, Thomas, to tell a few stories, if you like, about um, people who yourself and others who've had kind of bliss euphoria experiences with the plasma, with the Therify, and some of the hygiene around dealing with that, and also how that became somewhat of a communication device at a distance, etc.
Well, in fact, we were sitting here this morning talking about how it's become a collective experience, and that that we feel like we're all quantumly entangled, and we well, I said, can you just, even with your eyes open, can't you reach out with your heart, and can't you, and we were sitting here saying, well, we can feel Sarah, and we can feel Medere and Valerie, and when we clicked on the machine before, people were having their sessions, and I clicked it on, and immediately I thought I could hear you say, "Oh, the machine's on," and I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, Dan, it is," and I could feel it collectively, and I think that's why everybody's so blissed out. Everybody's so smiley around here, and we're sitting and singing songs, and Anu. This group of folks that's here is just an extraordinary. It's all been extraordinary, but we were sitting around, have like singing, and we've had collective meals and cooked as a group and eaten together, and it's just been lovely. And everybody's giving everybody else's back rubs, and we're meditating and walking in the woods. It's just been a lovely thing. It really has.
It's so wonderful, Thomas. But I remember specifically the first time that I felt you turn it on, you had your video on, and I could see you turn it on, and boy, did I feel it then. But then the second time in the conference with Sarah, when you turned it on, your video wasn't on, but I could feel it in your voice. So it was, yeah.
It makes me a little goofy, I think, and I
and
sure
the other thing I was hoping you would talk. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that. I mean, there's certain things you need to do to remain grounded in the presence of bliss, hydration and grounding, etc. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, absolutely. I these folks are coming for 3 and sometimes 4 sessions, that we're restricting, but I'm actually sitting next to the field a lot, and so I've been finding I'm becoming more familiar with it and being able to walk kind of around it without being fried, sort of. But we found that hydration really helps a lot. People's appetites change. We'll fix food, and then people kind of pick at it. Everybody's reminding everybody else to hydrate, and it seems to help a lot. And there's been some folks have had some GI distress. It seems to immediately kill off the parasites, and that seems to be a pretty common experience, is 1 or 2 episodes of some lower GI release, so to speak.
Because
as people
they're
becoming more familiar.
Sorry, go ahead.
People are saying that as their second and their third session, they're becoming more familiar with the energy and getting more out of it. And it certainly is my observation that they're doing much more substantial work as they get familiar with it. It's intriguing to me to watch them help each other, and it's spontaneous. They just kind of do that. And if you'd like, I can turn my camera on and ask these folks to talk.
While you're doing that, just also let's talk also, please do, but let's talk also a little bit about, literally grounding, like, kind of barefoot on and grounded material, real ground, and also that the environment is so important, a natural materials environment.
It is in a ONAC, Native American church, essentially sanctified ground, Cherokee ground, I'm blessed with a court of a magic spring here, and I'm a few miles from the Appalachian Trail. So folks are really plugging into the peace and the quiet and the extraordinary water. We're everybody's kind of walking around in bare feet and grounding, patting their feet a lot, talking a lot about grounding, and we're doing a lot of smudging too, aura clearing and such. And it varies with the group. This is a really particularly a spiritual group. And well,
Great.
there's Anu and Raina, and
Hi,
well,
Anu. Hello.
and
Hi, guys.
Hi, Mr. Winter.
woohoo!
Feeling good over here.
Hi, you're famous. Nice to see you. Great smiles.
Well, everybody's kind of blissed out, and it's a lovely collective experience. And as our it's like my heart is getting bigger. My heart chakra is getting so big, and as it grows, as this group grows, it's sort of it is a fellowship. It is and it's been lovely to extend it emotionally and energetically, and like you say, I can sit here and literally feel Valerie and Ray and Sarah and all the folks from yesterday, and the people who have been here and the people who are coming, that they're so excited. Their process starts when they decide to do it. And there's a young man coming from Michigan who's so excited. He says he's sure he won't need the plane to fly down.
That's great. Yeah, and we see it. It is a machine, but actually, the machine, the Therify, creates a bit of a plasma tornado. But it's ultimately the human's intention required to steer that tornado. That's the important thing.
Oh, absolutely, and that's what we're trying to do is to sit down. And I love what you said about approaching bliss like it's a lover. I think that might be a nice thing to share with people before they sit down, is approach its experiences as you would approach a sacred love experience. Yeah, because it really is, and it's a loving for yourself. It's opening your own heart and really getting that. It's just been and everybody's talking about feeling horny and primal feelings and but I mean, for me, my numb toes are gone. My prostate difficulty is greatly improved. I'm sleeping at night. My hands are better. I mean, it's just been, for me, it's just been an extraordinary thing. I feel like, like Woody Allen in Sleeper with his orgasmatron. You're gonna have to pry this machine out of my hands. Yeah.
I just like to share real quick, Dan, that I noticed that the sleep is very deep after experiencing the Therify field, and also there's a slight detoxing effect as far as tightness, stiffness, or soreness of the body. For me, anyway. But then your body seems to, it doesn't stay for long, it goes away, and then you feel pretty rejuvenated, relaxed, and the pain, I can definitely sense the pain reduction. But I also think that moving and going for a walk and stretching are key things to do after experiencing the field, to kind of, balance your body physically instead of just laying around. I definitely find that beneficial. But
that makes total sense. Makes total sense. And we've talked always about do the things associated with detox, and it's beautiful to hear your feedback. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I can see how it could help just a great variety of things without actually focusing on one thing in particular. And that's why I think it's going to be, beneficial for pretty much anyone that experiences it. So I'm very excited and honored. And this has just been an unreal experience. And I'm deeply gratified to be able to be here at Thomas's place to experience this. So thank you so much.
Oh, blessings. Thank you. And it really grateful for your feedback, and also to say that it's good that you emphasize that really you know, it isn't about experiencing a field like a church passively, but it's about really taking responsibility and gaining the discipline then to take responsibility for your own health as a result of steering your own tornado. Just the tornado speeds up, but then steering it becomes beautiful. Well said.
Well, Anu is going to speak for all womanhood now, I guess.
So you know, it's the goddess in everybody, male and female. But hi, Dan.
Hi.
Hi. So synchronicity is that. Yeah. So I was at this conference with Paul, and then I happened to Skype you to ask you about this plasma device. This was a couple of months ago, and you told me about Thomas Geckler. So here I am, and when I Skyped you, Paul was there, who had given the workshop in New York, and I didn't know y'all were working together. So that was really synchronistic.
Cool.
I don't know how often he's there, but that was, for me, quite a surprise. And then traveling up here to see Thomas, it's as if the implosion is happening even through the field, and then the Therify is verifying that. Kind of like the way I'm feeling is that it's the double torus in the middle, where that's where you know, I'm getting so small, like in time space, it's non-existent. So you guys are here and we're there. And that's the way it's feeling, to travel in and out of that field where synchronicity and everything flows so naturally.
It's wonderful. Wonderful to hear the feminine intuition side of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And glad to hear about those synchronicities. That's what we're talking about. Beautiful. And Paul would love to hear you tell that story too.
And this is as you've been developing this Priori device, which we've been kind of following on Facebook and through your website. So I think the gathering of the forces has been really like a trade wind to motorized travel, crossing on a lane. It's been amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you, Thomas.
No, this is my pleasure. I'm just having the best time. I'm meeting the best folks and increasing my spiritual family. This has just been wonderful, and it makes it real for me. And it's just a pleasure, and it's a brilliant device, Dan. And thank you so much for giving it.
Well, that's cool. And we're really clear that we're planting the seed of what fusion is, but we do the fusion together, and so it's the people that matter. Thank you.
Oh, no question. No question. It's the magic is in us, and it's just activating that. It's just reminding us that we are all of it. We are there. There's just one of us here, and I'm really experiencing that in a big way. That quantum coherence. I just feel so linked to everybody, and I'll sit here and I get overwhelmed by it. And I'm an easy cry anyway, but but it's just been an extraordinary experience to have people come here and be so nurturing and loving. And it hasn't been my experience at all in life. I go to a party and I can clear a room in about 5 minutes. So this and now I know where they all go. They go to places like this and hang out and talk about weird things together. So this is where they all go when they leave the room. So it's been a pleasure, and I invite everybody to come. It's Eden's coming this week. She'll be here next Saturday, and she's lurking in the room here quietly.
Yeah. Eden Grace just said, yeah, she just said, yay. Well, good, Eden. That's cool. Yes, and we're really clear that when we teach about what is the perfect way for waves to agree, it has a very practical meaning for a way for people to commune, literally fusion experience. That's what this is about. And it's grateful that you're making, and you know, what people used to go to church for is really this kind of charged communion, really. So wonderful. Thank you, Thomas, so much.
It really is a fellowship, and Wayne, I hope you don't wait in Oklahoma for your own machine. I hope you come here and play. It's going to be great to play with. So anyhow, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for the opportunity to share.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. We'll stay in touch and talk real soon. Blessings. So that was Wayne says he's coming. It's all cool. That's great. So that was a report from the Therify, and we're so grateful that Thomas has just been our best ambassador. And we're switching cameras here. And so we're going to send this little film to our Therify friends around the world and say, what a testimonial. It's cooking nicely. It's beautiful. Fabulous. So the last little piece of this evening's conversation was supposed to be applying this to a very disciplined conversation about the biology of Kundalini. And so I'm digging up a different slideshow here. Why, first of all, should we talk about Kundalini in this context? Well, Kundalini is a kind of climax of bliss experience. It's a biological lightning bolt of spin density. It's a climax of metabolic rate. It's a climax of the lightning of microwave and ultraviolet up your spine liquid pump. It's the climax of tornado steering. And personally, I was kind of adopted by Ben Bentoff, Itzhak, who wrote the book on Kundalini, Stalking Wild Pendulum, and I've been having or had Kundalini experiences frequently for over 30 years, starting with the Gurdjieff School Sacred Gymnastic. So the biology of Kundalini is very close to my heart, and I think teaching about the climax forms of bliss experience is an appropriate climax to this, which is the climax course of our two courses on the biology of bliss. So that's why I just think it will just look at the biomechanics of Kundalini as we finish this course on the biology of bliss and why it's a biological imperative. So first, I would like to, these slides here are from the article indexed at goldenmean.info/Kundalini, which is a report on my work with Bentoff and others. Remember, Bentoff documented Kundalini with a capacitive accelerometer. We're going to talk about that in a minute when we look at the slide from his machine. But basically, the body becomes the conductive dielectric between the plates of a capacitor, in which he can measure the micromotion with such accuracy he could see the components of the low frequencies of the heart wave as it was a wave that would affect your gravity onto the seat of your chair, said to have been the world's most sensitive capacitive accelerometric ever built. And we'll get to that, but I would work with Bentoff in his lab on this, and this information needs to be shared and needs to survive because it's essential to understanding the potential of the biology of the human condition. Ultimately, your blood evolves with the more bliss you have, your DNA braids recursively, coherently, and eventually you'll find yourself able to feel ley lines and magnetic lines more sensitively, and eventually to bend the energy lines and magnetic lines of the earth. Only love bends the light, therefore only love creates. Remember, when charge goes in a line, it's energy. When the same charge goes in a circle, you call that inertia mass. So literally, only love bends the light. What do you mean? Well, when you only bend the charge into a circle and create rotation of charge, that is creation. It's the creation of mass. It's physics. And therefore, only love bends the light, which is to say only perfect embedding. So, the first slide we want to look at is this one on the right at the top here. I'm going to zoom in now. Remember just a moment ago we talked about the two frequencies which were of the heart rate variability, the LF and the HF. The LF, low frequency component of HRV, is point here, 0.0959 hertz, which is the Mayer wave. The Mayer wave is the famous natural blood pressure resonance of the whole body, very famous, which happens to embed perfectly with heart rate variability's LF. And this is the entire discussion next week when we discuss HRV in our iPhone app. So here's the Mayer wave, and over here to the right would be the 0.251 HF, which is also fitting my equation. This is my equation on the screen here. The numbers in red are my equation, Planck time times exponent, integer exponents of golden ratio, producing these numbers in red, which turn out to be the spine liquid pump, the sacrocranial frequencies, the tidal frequencies, Upledger Institute, sacrocranial physics, and the spine liquid pump snake charmer is the physics of Kundalini. And look at the published documented tidal frequencies of the sacrocranial literature. Oops, I clicked on the link here. 1 second. So the low frequencies of the spine liquid pump, the tidal, remember, if your spine liquid is pumping, it is therefore clinically impossible to be depressed. This is Upledger Institute Sacrocranial Science 101. So, but it turns out these frequencies of the spine liquid pump, they're longer than your breath. It's ride the long wave, Uncle Joe. The long wave, so the long tidal is 0.01 hertz, which fits the 0.013 from my equation. And the mid-tidal frequency, the sacrocranial literature, is 0.0416 hertz, which is very close to my equation, 0.036 hertz. But what's so beautiful here is the Meyer wave and heart rate variability LF frequency, which is 0.09 hertz. And so the long story short is my equation for perfect phase conjugate collapse is the spine liquid pump, which is the centerpiece of Kundalini physics. Isn't that beautiful? And the other piece of this is right here. So there's the LF and the HF. But the other piece of this is, so we got to Bob Dratch's microwave emission scanning technology, and I wish Bob Dratch was with us this evening. But there he was at Greg Hoag's home in Boulder, Colorado, Metaforms, and we were measuring BLISS and Kundalini by measuring the microwave from Wendy Thacker's spine. Jose Argoyes' partner or friend at that time, Wendy Thacker, and so he takes his microwave scanning emissions technology, which starts with this frequency right here. This is adenosine diphosphate, ADP. Now, I'm trying to introduce the physics of DNA radio, plasma communion, it's called mitogenic radiation, how cells communicate. This is the frequency, the high frequencies that come out of cell metabolism, which is obviously Druid phone calls and the physics of telepathy. And it's microwave. And Dratch proved that before Donald Rumsfeld stole the invention from him, as Donald Rumsfeld stole the invention of GPS from Bob Dratch. We believe this is true, actually. A good percentage of people who try to register patents in the United States, it's stolen by the U.S. government. How many patents have they hidden? National security is a metaphor for a kleptocracy. That's my view. But this is not conspiracy theory this evening. This is physics. So Dratch built a microwave scanning horn gun, a microwave amplifier. It was a gold cross inside a microwave amplifier horn. If you want to study the physics of magic, you study microwave amplifiers. This is 101 for the physics of magic. If you know anything about how insects navigate, it's the coherent microwave. And the microwave radiance of the carvings on the pyramid walls is the physics of insect navigation, and Phil Callahan proved it, and we discussed that in the film I made with him. Another story. So this microwave of DNA radio is very important. And here, this is the frequency of adenosine diphosphate, which, remember, every energy transaction inside your cell, if you know any biophysics, when energy comes in, the cell stores it, and adenosine diphosphate jumps to adenosine triphosphate, ADP to ATP. And this is a teeter-totter. This is a quantum lever. And this is literally the dollar bill of cellular energy transactions. It's always in an even number of dollar bills. And if you measure how many dollar bills the cell is transacting energy, you measure how many times adenosine diphosphate changes to adenosine triphosphate, ATP, and you measure how much metabolic activity is happening inside the cell. So if you measure the cell emission for that frequency in microwave, the quantum distance, the quantum physics of DNA radio is ADP to ATP, because that's where the cell stores energy every time it has extra energy. This is the energy storage mechanism of all cellular metabolism, and therefore the physics of DNA radio. And so when Bob Dratch tuned the microwave scanner to that frequency and scanned Wendy Thacker's spine, I was there, and he made a graph of that microwave emission, and up and down the spine he read and described the history of psychological trauma of her life by the blockages in energy in her spine with this microwave scanner, which should have replaced almost all other forms of hospital scanning, except the military declared it a threat to national security and told Bob Dratch he would go to jail if he shared what is pure shareable information. Tut tut to the military, bad news. And then Bob Dratch took that same microwave scanning horn gun and scanned the horizon and proved to us that it was the ultimate dowsing tool. Isn't that cool? In other words, the Earth grid magnetic lines are profoundly symbiotic to cellular ATP microwave. This is why the Kozyrev mirrors to make telepathy work had to be at the magnetic line crosses. They measured the nanoteslas because this was the phase conjugate fractal physics of DNA radio and Druid phone calls. And the Kozyrev proved the physics of telepathy, and Dr. Korotkov made all the measurements. It's real and solid, and it's the physics of telepathy because this was phase conjugate longitudinal communion of saints, as it were. So this is old information, that the microwave coming from the cell allows you to measure Kundalini in the spine. We did it with Dratch, and where the spine is blocked in microwave transmission, you can actually do the psychological block history. And when Dratch was finished describing the energy of Wendy Thacker's spine, Wendy was crying because he read her body beautifully with the microwave. So that's old news. That happened how many years ago? I don't want to say because I'm old, I'm young, I'm whatever. But what I discovered this year, or last year, was that I analyzed this frequency, and here is the wavelength of adenosine diphosphate, here's 1.5 and here's 2, so this is about 1.9 angstroms, the wavelength of ATP. And if you look at my equation for Planck length and time times golden ratio exact exponents, you have 1.93 angstroms. I knew this because I had just analyzed the physics of the origin of color based on the equation. So look, I have proved that ADP frequency is phase conjugate negentropic collapse precisely tuned to Planck, the 0 point. So that's why ATP metabolism is negentropic, because it's charge collapse. I just think that was really cool. So here is phase conjugate negentropic collapse wave in ATP, in Schumann harmonics, in sacrocranial harmonics, and in the breath, and in heart rate variability. It's all the same. So next slide. I carried on. This is Bentov. This is his book. The book is called Stalking the Wild Pendulum, the original book on the biomechanics of Kundalini. And here is the actual graph. and this is before computers. So the Bentov's way of storing the graph of the output of the capacitive accelerometer was to take a Polaroid photograph of the output of the strip chart recorder. And what he proved here was that Kundalini starts when the heart is beating. This is the heartbeat, and this is the biggest pipe, aorta, in the body. And it goes down to the branch at your legs. It's called the aortic crotch. And this is a standing wave. And when you relax, this standing wave becomes an efficient resonator like a violin string. And this is the beginning of HRV and EKG coherence. So basically, a relaxed heart, he measured this, that the EKG harmonics locked into phase with the ventricle liquids of the brain. Now, in the next slide, you're going to see that Bentoff measured the ringing in the ears heard by meditators. So I want to talk about that because he also showed that that was calculated to be locked in to the spine liquid pump. So basically, the low frequency of the heart rate variability, and the spine liquid pump sacrocranial, he measured as ringing the brain like what he called, quote, a can of peaches. And he showed that this phonon wave would then bounce back and forth inside the head and cause a ringing in the ear called sangreal, song in the blood, sound current, which is, as Valerie will attest, quite literally the voices of your ancestors. This was the introduction to clairaudience, which after my intense Kundalini for so many years, I became clairaudient. I'm not very good at it. I'm a bit lazy. I don't do it with enough discipline, but I often, in certain circumstances, definitely hear the voices of ancestors, particularly when I was in the sacred Cherokee burial ground, incidentally, Thomas, in the Circle of Life community there we founded in Waynesville, North Carolina, underneath Bucky Fuller's geodesic dome, installed by John Denver. So I knew that the ringing in the ears was connected to the voices of ancestors because I would sit under the Cherokee sacred tree there, Thomas, with your Cherokee sacred space, and frequently I would hear the voices of ancestors. And I realized what it was, that it was actually ancestral memory radiating in DNA radio. Kundalini is diagnosed as schizophrenia, but if you know how the voices of ancestors work, it's just that you're designed to be a good radio. And when Kundalini works, you suddenly have a couple thousand extra radio stations available. And the thing is, if you don't have the willpower and inner discipline of focus to be the radio tuner to select among all those stations, that's when Kundalini becomes schizophrenia, because you need to have the inner force to sort among that many radio stations. And that's the inner discipline, which is the same as saying that when you inhabit the center of a lightning bolt, if you think an unshareable thought, you will immediately generate heat, because only pure intention is superconductive. And that's the Dannion Brinkley kind of experience. Anyway, back to Bentoff. So after Bentoff measured this phase lock of the heart's low frequency with the spine liquid pump with the brain wave ringing like a can of peaches, this would then cause a pressure wave on the ventricle horns here, which the horns would then become more articulated. It's called the liquid ventricle horns. And what happens is when this conservation of this ultraviolet current coming up the spine liquid, the waveguide for the microwave and high frequency ultraviolet, remember, the tailbone suddenly opens up and becomes a straw, and you have this peristaltic pumping of the HRV, the sacrocranial, and so the spine suddenly sucks. So Kundalini really sucks in the sense that it sucks this ultraviolet coherence from the blue dish at the tailbone, which is where the ultraviolet has been gathered. It's sort of like the foreplay for BLISS. This juicy ultraviolet is gathered at your tail. And if you've conserved your sexual energy, and this Wilhelm Reich sadly did not know when he wrote The Function of the Orgasm, then I was a virgin at the time, so I had a lot of frustrated sexual energy for sure. A double Scorpio and a virgin, there you go. I had some sting to conserve, and so that's turned inside out, and the tailbone became a straw, and it opens up. The vestigial horse hairs of the tailbone actually gather the ultraviolet coherence and convey it up the spine liquid pump, which is where it's peristaltically pumped with the microwave component, all in the phase conjugate array, and negentropic collapse, imploding to that lightning bolt at the center, which is the Planck dimension, which is the sort of God's radio. And this creates an explosion of nutrient and growth in the high brain. And so the way Kundalini has been described in literature as a red hot coal, your pineal, inside your head that's burning, and you can't knock out the red hot coal. And until this burns a hole through your crown, and in my case, and you can feel it, there's a big lump, a huge crease, a big point that evolved at the top of my head. My top of my head literally became pointy like a cone head. And my Otto van in the Netherlands, his top of his head point, and you can see that the cone head story is related to this evolution of the Kundalini, because the sacrocranial liquid pressures become so great pressing on the top of your head, it literally pushes through. And I felt that pressure. It's pretty intense. And eventually the crown at the top of your head feels like a cone of charge going up in the stars, and you feel this. And this is why Kundalini is called the great masts of God in the Iceland tradition. And that is the appendix to Bentoff's book with Lisa Nella, MD, who wrote the parallel book called Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence. And I traveled with Lisa Nella, MD, and his partner, Frida Morris, when Arthur Young invited us to his home to play with his Rolls-Royce collection and discuss Arthur Brundler's brainwave scale radiation experiments with Arthur Young. Like I say, this is the Forrest Gump of the science of consciousness generation. I serve that humble function. Anyway, later I found out that this explosion of Kundalini could be used for things like making rain. I mean, any kid who stands barefoot in the mud and has been blissful can focus in a cloud and put a hole in the cloud. And we've explained the physics many times. The same 60-degree cone that Wilhelm Reich used for weather engineering on the high seas, Trevor Constable, is implosive charge, and that causes the water vapor to find a way to share permission to touch. And that centripetal electrical force is what allows the water vapor molecules to agree to touch, and that is the physics of precipitation called forming a droplet. So we know exactly why focused attention can put a hole in a cloud. In the same way it's been measured, focused attention dramatically reduces radioactive half-life in the work of Uri Geller, or more generally known in the work of Bill Tiller, Conscious Acts of Creation. His book in the Stanford Physics proved that focused attention causes electric fields to compress. And now, for the first time, thanks to my work, we know why. Because charge compression, phase conjugate compression, is the plasma nature of attention and perception. So it was very natural then that I started having flashbacks, and this is the whole Tutankhamun story about, you know, you fire the pharaoh if he can't make rain, because I realized that intense Kundalini experience often precipitated these big storms. And that's when I began studying the work of John Dee and did rituals with Vincent Bridges, and he had his past life memories as Kelly, and he said I was John Dee, but whatever. But really, it's simply how to be the centripetal force in a plasma tornado. That's what Kundalini is. And we had some experiences with Valerie in Australia where we had this, we did succeed in ending a drought there, actually, quite consciously. And some of the weather charts, I think we put this article, goldenmean.info/rain. And I won't say I can do it with any discipline, but I have had the experience. And we know the physics. Rolling Thunder explained quite accurately how he caused rain. He said he would tickle the underbelly of a certain black beetle, which in Egypt would have been called a scarab. And we now know that the nervous system of that particular black beetle was probably and almost definitely idealized electrical fractality, hence, and even properly holding and focusing in a pine cone is quite effective in rain making under the right circumstances. And there are many other factors. The point we're making is that Kundalini is environmentally powerful. It's effective. I mean, humans were designed to eventually be plasma tornadoes big enough to inhabit a star and make it centripetal. That's why stars made people. We have a function to become centripetal. So don't be surprised if when your aura grows up, you begin to steer tornadoes. Of course, psychokinesis is a natural a graduation of the human condition. It's not something strange. It isn't even necessarily religious. It simply practically means you're growing up. You need to be psychokinetic ultimately, or you're toast. Because if you don't get a big aura, you ain't gonna make it. So let's not be overly dramatic about discovering the various forms of psychokinesis. It's simply the plasma physics of mind. And we could get into all the karma of the Tutankhamun Akhenaten stories here, but that's not where we wanted to go with this conversation. There's just one other little slide we wanted to share here. keep clicking on these things. And yeah, this is the other slide I wanted to share. Every time I click on one of these, it takes me to another browser window. I got to be careful not to close this window or we're in trouble. But this is just the one other slide I wanted to show here. I dreamed about doing this for years, and finally I managed to dig up Bentoff's original slide. These are the frequencies. So what he did is he had a good preparation for alchemy, Kevin. You're right. Alchemy is alchem, this access to charge fusion. Isotope transition is basically optimized by phase conjugate negentropic collapse. It is fusion. It defines cold fusion. Anybody who wants to study cold fusion has to study phase conjugate negentropic collapse. Hint, hint, Mr. Rossi. You know, an isotope transition project is one of the projects we have some international support for, and the scientists are lining up, and it's going to happen. We have the frequencies and temperatures to transmute virtually every commercially valuable isotope transition in the atomic table. Aluminum to silver is only one of them. And once you understand phase conjugate collapse, this is the physics of alchemy, which happens to be the expertise of Paul, who teaches practical hands-on alchemy, our partner for Therify. So these things all fit together. In fact, eventually they fuse. So the last slide we were supposed to do here, and I see it's after 10 p.m. here, is Bentoff gathered the meditators who all heard a ringing in their ears. He was best buddies with Maharishi, the TM group, and we had meetings. In fact, I taught at Fairfield, Iowa, the Maharishi TM Center, and then later Bentoff adopted me and called me his guardian angel when he was meeting with the Maharishi in Switzerland when we had our conference with Bucky Fuller there in Florence, Italy, and then and so this whole thing about the critical mass of the of how meditation can affect the crime rate in a community. This was the physics because Bentoff was best buddies with the Maharishi. And it's no irony, or it's probably great irony, that about 20 years later, when we had our Physics of Consciousness conference in Budapest, I think it was our second one there, and we had 3 PhD physicists trained by the Maharishi. We had John Hageland, we had Alex Henke, and we had, who was the third PhD physicist? Oh, East Van Deens, the co-founder of the conference. So 3 PhD physicists trained by the Maharishi who were basically functionally clueless about the physics of consciousness because they said, oh, no, you're not supposed to understand. This is the Maharishi. There's some issues. But there was a climax event of the karma with the Maharishi when we had their 3 PhD physicists there. And not one of them knew. When I showed the one of them, the PhD physicist Alex Henke, I showed him the golden mean ratio in his own brainwaves, changed his life, and realized that the physics of consciousness had another dimension, namely phase conjugation. So, because, you know, the TM people never measured brain coherence, even though they talked about it. We did. They didn't know how to do the spectrum, just like HeartMath Institute have never measured heart coherence. But anyway, so Bentoff gathers the TM meditators, and he has them tune an audio oscillator to the ringing of the frequencies they're hearing. And he makes this graph right here to the frequencies, the ringing in the ear, the sound current heard by meditators. And look here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of these principal harmonics heard by meditators fit almost exactly the phase conjugate. These are the phase conjugate calculated frequencies of sound from my equation, golden mean ratio, integer exponent times plot length and time. And here are the ringing in your ears heard by meditators, suggesting that, in fact, phase conjugate collapse from hydrogen to your spine liquid pump, to your heart rate variability, to your breathing, to your brainwave harmonics, to the ringing heard in the ear, are all participate in one single caduceus implosive conjugate negentropic collapse, meaning you're accessing the radio at the heart of the symbol of the Tao, the Planck, simply by participating in BLISS process. So we could carry on. I don't know if I finished the slides here. It's after 10 o'clock. Usually at this point in the conversation, we turn this over to questions. This is some work we did in the early heart tuner invention, where we showed that the major low frequency of the heart, the lowest frequency of the heart, that would center on 1.0 hertz or 0.618 hertz, and that when your heart's low frequency musical key signature of heart centered on 0.618 hertz, golden ratio, it actually was a more empathic state of the heart, that when your heart's musical fundamental was at 1.0 hertz. And so this is another example of golden ratio in the heart. Okay, Hayam says, do you have some practical tips for sustaining the bliss state? Now that's a practical question. Actually, I believe it's in 2 weeks from now when we have the entire evening's course dedicated to that exact question. We talk about the diet, the hygiene, the yoga, and the discipline of thinking. But, and we'll talk about that more later, but just the biggest part of the answer to your question is that essentially, you know, when you go to bed at night, if you're able to review your whole day like it's a movie and play it and not interrupt, it does charge compression and compresses your day and proves that you've rendered each experience into the pure principle that makes it shareable, thus meaning you're ready for bliss and death. In other words, you've processed your day. This is a Sufi Gurdjieffian exercise. Well, to sustain bliss is the same. You must think only shareable thoughts. What does that mean? That means you must think only pure intention. We have now measured pure intention. We know exactly the physics. Climax form of heart coherence, called phase conjugate. You can tell when people are telling the truth, their heart coherence goes up. That's called the heart tuner. That's my invention. That's why I'm credited in the literature with inventing the concept of heart coherence, because I invented how to measure it. The Cepstrum, the second order power spectra, fractalfield.com/coherence, which we will discuss in great detail in 1 week from today in the heart coherence course of fractalu.com. So simply put, that every time you have an experience, if you've learned to distill that experience into pure principle, it's like recognizing there's an essence behind everything that happens. And if you see through the essence, the pure principle of what just happened, suddenly all of DNA is nourished by your perception of what just happened. The spin density goes right through center, and therefore you could stay in the middle of the lightning bolt without being burnt. The lightning bolt is the movie powder. The lightning bolt is Kundalini. The lightning bolt is bliss, which is specifically charged spin density. And every time you think a thought which is not pure, not perfectly shareable, not distilled to pure principle, suddenly you waver from the center of the lightning bolt and you create incoherence, non-phase coherence, called heat, and you're toast. So that's why to sustain bliss, you need to remain focused on pure principle. Another way to think about pure principle is, here you are living your life, and you're deciding, well, should you study tax law or should you study pure physics? You say, well, tax law will change next year. Maybe you shouldn't spend too much time. Whereas pure principles of physics, 1,000,000 years from now, when you incarnate again, will still be useful. That's called pure principle. So the more you can focus on pure principle, the more you inhabit the center of the lightning bolt, and that's how you sustain bliss. That's just an introduction to the science of thinking. In practice, it means you can't harbor anger, because anger is literally destructive interference by definition. If you look at the wave shape for anger at goldenmean.info/touch, it's 1/7. It's destructive wave interference optimized. You could use anger to get the money changers kicked out of a temple, but if you remain in anger, the destructive interference will self-destroy you. It's self-destructive. So you can't hang on to anger. No, 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 no. Use it for short term. If you need it a little bit, okay. But in general, destructive wave interference does not produce immortality. So let's see, questions. So Dan, what prevents enlightenment on the planet is ignorance, and only by embedding at the proper race group, the dark forces would transform and join the light. Question mark. Yes, it's another way of saying live is L, phase shift into the I, focus of phi, recursion, Li phi, to live. Now, if you do the mirror phase conjugate opposite image of live, evil, which is live spelled backwards, is for a waveform to exit from perfect embedding. So entering perfect embedding is to live, and to depart from perfect embeddability is evil. So a wave that fails to embed is defined as evil. The good news is that will self-cancel by definition. And so education is basically simply the only way out of this dilemma. Pure principle is the solution because it's a perfectly shareable wave. Is there a benefit to Sufi whirling, spinning, and dance to create bliss experience? Why does this practice create bliss? I think we told it. I have a beautiful color slide of there's a science magazine that analyzed Sufi turning, dervish turning as time travel and gravity production. But the easiest way to introduce that conversation is when the Sufi master tells the dervish to begin the turn, the dervish will bow, and then he will focus intently on his heart. And if he creates a centripetal force, literally makes his own gravity in his heart, then when he begins to turn, to do the Sufi dance, he will not get dizzy. The cliche interpretation of that, which is also good physics, is that if the dervish gets dizzy when he spins, that is proof that he has not yet got pure intention. You see, that's a precise confirmation of just what we were discussing about how to inhabit lightning bolts non-destructively, called perfect bliss. Ask Daniel Brinkley, whose 2 lightning bolts experiences produced the near-death experience called his 2 books on how to take memory through death. It was surviving lightning. And everybody he'd touch after being hit by lightning, he had so many flashes of their lifetime memories that he was afraid to touch people. Why? Because his DNA had done the jitterbug. If you zap a DNA thread with a little bit of lightning at the moment of crystallization, just like a gold mono thread, it will become measurably superconductive. And so Daniel Brinkley's DNA in his book on near-death experience had become a superconductor at the moment of lightning, and therefore everyone he touched, he got dense flashes of every peak emotion of their lifetime, and he couldn't stand it at first. So the Sufi dance, the turn, is just like inhabiting lightning, that when you keep your attention at the center, this is the dense form of this mystery, which is the electrical nature of human attention as not just a plasma compression device, implosive compression, but literally the ability to fabricate the centripetal low pressure point, which is the steering center of every electrical tornado. Tornadoes only follow the center of lowest pressure. How does human attention steer tornadoes? By fabricating the center of lowest pressure. How does human attention fabricate the center of lowest pressure, sometimes called a magnetic monopole, which is what we'll be discussing in our 0 Point Energy Electrical Engineers Conference here in 15 minutes. We've measured a magnetic monopole, thanks to Elizabeth Bill. So the fabrication of the magnetic monopole is how you steer the tornado, human attention. So the mystery here is simply, what is the electric nature of human attention? That is the heart of this mystery, which is, if it's able to remain centered, then the dervish will not get dizzy. Remember, Bill Tiller measured human attention causes electric fields to compress. Well, the dervish master says This was the Gurdjieff School Sacred Gymnastics teacher, my teacher, Pierre Elliott, whose PhD physics was in the physics of flame at the Sorbonne, quite literally the flame in the mind. And Pierre Elliott told us, before we started this Gurdjieff sacred gymnastic, which precipitated my Kundalini, he said, when you can place your attention in your baby finger with enough electrical force to cause it to begin to tingle, he called that put feeling in your finger. When your attention in your baby finger is electrically has enough inertia to cause the tingling to begin, then you're ready to study the sacred dance. Why did he say that? The same way the focus of the therapy in your baby finger can cause it to tingle. We know that it actually can get cold because it eliminates heat. Because only when your attention reaches a certain critical mass of inertia, and you're actually consciously aware that you're producing electrical inertia with your attention, only at that point are you ready to begin the sacred dance. What is the sacred dance? The path to bliss. What does that mean? It means now you know how to do the ritual dance called meiosis and mitosis. I mean, you now know how to embed yourself in a longer wave and eventually steer bigger and bigger tornadoes. It's called refining the electric quality of your attention. Fortunately, now we electrical engineers know what that means. The inertia of your attention grows electrically, and that is measurable. When Bill Tiller in Conscious Acts of Creation measured focused human attention causes electric fields to compress, what he did not measure was that after doing the Sufi dance and having bliss, then the amount of electrical inertia, centripetal force, charge compression in your attention would increase. Literally, you became more psychokinetic. It's an electrical engineering problem solved with the hygiene of attention. So the hygiene for attention, John Wong says, does the collective focus of human attention of a large group have more electrical potential inertia than a single person? Excellent question, John. What we were taught in the Gurdjieff tradition was that one of the primary reasons to doing sacred dance and meditation in group work, one of the primary benefits was because that initially your attention did not have enough critical mass from you by yourself. Therefore, doing this in a group would help show you that the group work could develop the critical mass of inertia. So you could begin to feel the bliss wave consciously only when there was group work, because the feeling wasn't great enough. You didn't have enough inertia from yourself as an individual. This is useful insight, because once you have your first bliss experience, you are so highly motivated to pursue it that no one outside you has to tell you, oh, go follow your bliss anymore, because you know what it is. But until you have your first bliss experience, it's like this is not real to you. And so for that, you badly need the group work. Plus, later, when you want to take your plasma through a star like the sun, doing this as a group adds much more safety and collective inertia. So there's many, many reasons to do bliss process as part of group work. It's also true that, like with the Tibetan saint who says, take refuge in my aura, I will protect you from astral parasites. The Tibetans call that taking refuge. The Tibetan master also says at that moment that you are not allowed anymore to express negative emotion, because any negativity you express will affect the whole group. That means that probably you don't want to do bliss with any other person that you would not trust to be your lover, because it is that kind of plasma communion. You know, After you make love with someone, you can never get out of the bathwater. It's like Bell's theorem. When the photons fuse, even if they fly apart faster than the speed of light, they're always going to be connected. This is the plasma fusion that results from lovemaking. And this is an introduction to the hygiene for selecting not just your lovers, but your bliss partners in general. So pick them carefully. In a practical way this is done is your little meditation sacred dance group, yoga group, gets together every X number of weeks, and they do their yoga together, then they do their bliss meditation together, then they have the dinner together, and then they cry together for each other's pain and their joy. And eventually they begin to feel each other's feelings, and then they're ready for collective bliss process and learning to lucid dream as one. E pluribus unum. This is the true physics of plasma fusion and the astral hygiene for group work. Must the group be located in the same area? Well, Thomas has shown that, the plasma connection can go across distances. Of course, it does help if the group members are separated, if they're each at a ley line cross, the Findorn power point. So plasma communion is possible at a distance, but for convenience, it's nice to start together. But eventually they can be at a distance. And in fact, we proved with heart coherence measure that in the iPhone environment, heartsring.com, that you can link EKG across the planet and then feel each other as one by micromotion entrainment at a distance. And that's what biofeedback capability, heartsring.com. Kevin says we did it with Bob over the grid. That's great. Yes, it's very, very important to understand the basics of geobiology and grid engineering to understand the likely sites, even the definition of sacred site, to understand how to better do communing experiences. And we introduced all that science of ley lines and crosses and measures and magnetics and feeling it in your blood and dousing with your hands, and the science at goldenmean.info/geobiology. Okay. Yes, it is like gospel singing. Wayne's going outside to do figure eights in the meadow in the woods. I think that's a great suggestion. Okay, so right now, all of us are going to go out in the woods and do figure eights. Perfect. It's been a great night. John Wong says, you mentioned about teaching bliss experience to young people. Any practical advice for doing so? Well, we started the book called Conscious Kids, Ecstasy and Immortality, and the PDF complete is there at goldenmean.info/consciouskids, was our beginning of how to teach a teenager the science of bliss and the practice of bliss. But remember, in 2 weeks, our course will be about the practical aspects, the yoga, the hygiene, the diet for bliss experience, the environment. So we'll talk even the breath. So we have a complete 2-hour course coming up on that subject. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks for coming. We had fun. Blessings and namaste. Follow your bliss. Sweet dreams. Bye-bye. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Susan and Robert and Ray. Sweet dreams. Good night. Memorable. Bye-bye. Follow your bliss.